Your fasting glucose came back at 94. Your A1C was 5.3%. Your doctor said everything looks perfectly normal. Here's what neither of those numbers actually told you. They're both backward-looking averages. They don't show the spike you had after lunch, or the crash an hour later, or the fact that the exact same meal might be doing something completely different inside your coworker's body than it's doing inside yours. Until 2024, the only way to see any of that in real time required a prescription. Now you can just buy the device. No diabetes diagnosis required, no doctor's note, just a sensor stuck to your arm. Continuous glucose monitors, or CGMs, have officially gone mainstream for people who've never had a blood sugar problem in their life. So is this a genuinely useful upgrade to how you understand your own body, or an expensive gadget selling data most healthy people don't actually need to worry about? I dug into the actual research on this, not the marketing, and the honest answer sits in a more interesting place than either extreme. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what these devices can and can't tell you, and whether the research actually supports wearing one if you're not diabetic. Continuous glucose monitors have existed for years, but strictly as prescription medical devices for people managing diabetes, primarily those on insulin, who need frequent real-time glucose data to avoid dangerous highs and lows. That changed in March 2024, when the FDA cleared Dexcom's Stello as the first over-the-counter CGM, available without a prescription. Abbott followed a few months later with two devices of their own, Lingo and Libre Rio. These devices use essentially the same sensor technology as the prescription versions, a small patch worn on the back of your upper arm, measuring glucose in the fluid just under your skin, sending real-time data to your phone every few minutes for roughly 2 weeks per sensor. Here's the part worth sitting with for a second. Dexcom's own Stello is specifically intended for adults who don't take insulin, while Abbott's Lingo is explicitly marketed to the general wellness consumer, people with no diabetes diagnosis at all. That's a genuinely new category, and it raises an obvious question. What exactly is a healthy person supposed to learn from data that was originally built for a completely different medical purpose? Fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C, the two standard blood sugar tests, are genuinely useful, well-validated tools, but they share a specific limitation. They're both essentially long-term averages or single snapshots. A1C reflects your average blood sugar over roughly the past 3 months. Fasting glucose captures a single moment, first thing in the morning, before you've eaten anything at all. Neither test shows you what's called postprandial variation, the rise and fall of glucose, specifically after meals, throughout an ordinary day. And here's a genuinely interesting, well-documented finding from glucose research. 2 people can eat the exact same meal and produce measurably different glucose curves, based on factors including their gut microbiome composition, sleep the night before, stress levels, and how much they moved earlier that day. Your normal response to a bowl of pasta might look meaningfully different from your neighbor's, even with identical lab results on paper. So the core promise of CGMs for healthy people is compelling on paper. Catch the kind of glucose pattern your standard tests are structurally blind to, potentially years before anything would show up on a routine blood panel. But compelling on paper and proven to actually help are two very different claims, and this is exactly where the research gets a lot more careful than the marketing does. A systematic review published in 2025, examining CGM use specifically in non-diabetic individuals, concluded that CGM shows genuine promise for personalizing lifestyle interventions and improving glycemic outcomes. But that's a notably more careful phrase than proven to work. A separate, more recent systematic review and meta-analysis, examining the broader body of evidence through the end of 2025, found something researchers were refreshingly honest about. The actual effectiveness of CGM for improving glycemic parameters, body weight, and behavioral outcomes in non-diabetic populations remains unclear, which the authors specifically noted limits confident, evidence-based recommendations for widespread clinical use right now. Here's a specific telling detail from that research. CGM reliably identifies meaningful post-meal glucose spikes in people who already have prediabetes, genuinely useful, actionable data for that group. But that same phenomenon was described as less frequently observed in healthy controls. In plain terms, people with no metabolic dysfunction generally don't show the same dramatic, concerning spikes to begin with, which somewhat undercuts the idea that every healthy person is walking around with a hidden problem their CGM is about to reveal. So the research paints a genuinely nuanced picture. Real promise, real open questions, and a notable gap between this device shows you real data and this device proves you have a problem worth solving. Which leads to the part almost nobody selling these devices talks about upfront: what a completely normal glucose response can look like on the graph, even though it might feel alarming the first time you see it appear on your phone. Here's something genuinely important that gets lost in a lot of CGM marketing. A rise in blood glucose after eating is not by itself a sign that something is wrong. It's the completely normal, expected physiological response to eating carbohydrates. Your pancreas releases insulin specifically to manage that rise and bring glucose back down. That entire process working as intended is what a spike actually looks like on a graph, even in someone with perfectly healthy metabolism. The clinically meaningful question isn't, did my glucose go up after I ate rice? It almost certainly did, and it's supposed to. The more meaningful questions are how high it climbed relative to established reference ranges, and, just as importantly, how quickly it came back down afterward. A response that spikes and returns to baseline within roughly 2 hours looks very different physiologically from one that stays elevated for 4 or 5 hours. This is where an unregulated new consumer category runs into a real risk. Without any medical guidance built into interpreting the data, it's genuinely easy for someone to see a completely normal post-meal rise, panic, and develop an unnecessarily restrictive or anxious relationship with ordinary foods based on a data point that never actually indicated a problem in the first place. So if the raw data can be genuinely misread even by well-intentioned, health-conscious people, does that mean these devices are a bad idea for non-diabetics? Not necessarily. It just means the honest answer depends heavily on who you are and what you're actually trying to learn. Based on the current state of the evidence, here's a genuinely balanced way to think about this. CGMs appear most clearly useful for people with prediabetes, where research shows a meaningfully higher rate of real, actionable glucose spikes being caught that standard A1C testing misses entirely. If you've been told you're prediabetic, this is a population where the evidence base is the strongest. For generally healthy people, the value is more about behavioral awareness than diagnosis. Some research on CGM use for lifestyle modification suggests real-time feedback can meaningfully improve dietary adherence and engagement. Essentially, seeing an immediate, visual consequence of a food choice can be a genuinely effective behavior change tool for some people, independent of whether any individual reading reflects a real medical problem. A quick, honest note before trying one yourself. This is genuinely a consumer wellness product, not a diagnostic tool, and the research is still evolving. This isn't medical advice, and if you have real concerns about your blood sugar, that conversation belongs with a doctor, who can also help you interpret CGM data accurately if you do decide to use one, rather than trying to self-diagnose from a graph on your phone. If you're generally healthy and simply curious, a short-term trial, a few weeks, not an ongoing subscription, can be a genuinely interesting, low-risk way to learn your own personal response to different foods, sleep patterns, and stress. Treat it as a curiosity tool rather than a medical alarm system. If you find yourself feeling anxious, restrictive, or fixated on perfect numbers after a few days of wearing one, that's a real signal worth taking seriously. The tool isn't working for you the way it's intended to, and stopping is a completely reasonable choice. So here's the honest answer. Continuous glucose monitors for non-diabetics aren't a scam, and they're not a miracle either. The research shows real promise specifically for people with prediabetes, genuine but more modest behavioral value for healthy people, and a real risk of misreading completely normal biology as a problem if you don't know what you're actually looking at. Whether one of these buys you useful self-knowledge or just an anxious new habit depends entirely on how you use the data, not on the device itself. If this gave you a clearer, more honest picture of what these devices can actually tell you, subscribe. I break down what the science actually says. No fluff, no fear-mongering.